Walk down the coffee aisle and you'll see bags stamped 100% Arabica, gourmet, organic, or single origin. But lab testing keeps turning up a different story. Researchers using spectroscopy and chemical fingerprinting have found that a surprising number of grounds labeled 100% Arabica actually contain a meaningful percentage of cheaper Robusta beans blended in, something scientists at institutes like Quadram in the UK have specifically developed testing methods to catch, because it's common enough to be a real problem in the industry. It gets murkier than just bean swapping. Studies going back decades and still being published today have caught roasted and ground coffee cut with fillers like chicory, roasted barley, corn, coffee husks, soybean, and even wheat flour, added purely to bulk up the product and stretch profit margins, often at levels well above what regulators consider accidental contamination. Origin claims aren't much safer to trust either. The most infamous case in the US involved coffee sold for years, labeled as premium Kona from Hawaii, that turned out, in many instances, to be only a small fraction actual Kona beans, mixed with cheap coffee from elsewhere. A scandal that eventually led to lawsuits and settlements once growers and investigators dug into supply chains. And because coffee passes through so many hands between farm and shelf, pickers, processors, exporters, roasters, distributors, it's considered one of the most fraud-prone food commodities in the world. With some food safety researchers estimating that mislabeling in food products broadly could affect as much as 1 in 10 items on store shelves. None of this means every bag is fake, but it does mean the label alone can't tell you what's really in your cup. And that premium, artisanal, and 100% are marketing words first and verified facts a distant second. 1,000 and more words, marshaled documented claims while planning, expansive response marshaled documented claims while planning expansive response. Then there's the decaffeination question, which most people never think about until they see it in a lab report. A large share of decaf coffee sold in the US, including some from major chains, is processed using a chemical called methylene chloride, sometimes referred to as the European method, which strips caffeine out of the raw beans by soaking them in the solvent before rinsing and roasting. Methylene chloride has been classified as a carcinogen by the National Toxicology Program, the EPA, and the World Health Organization. And while the FDA maintains that residual trace amounts in coffee are far below any dangerous threshold, health advocacy groups, including the Clean Label Project, have formally petitioned the agency to reconsider that approval, arguing the safety data is decades old and doesn't reflect how much decaf people actually drink today. What makes this trickier for shoppers is that US manufacturers aren't required to disclose which decaffeination method they used on the label, so unless a bag explicitly says Swiss water processed, solvent-free, or CO2 processed, there's often no way to know from the shelf whether you're getting a chemically stripped bean or one decaffeinated using plain water or pressurized carbon dioxide instead. Mold is another issue nobody wants to think about with their morning cup. Coffee beans, especially lower grade or improperly dried in stored batches, are vulnerable to mycotoxins, toxic byproducts produced by mold that can survive the roasting process in small amounts. Ochratoxin A is the one researchers watch most closely. And while heavily regulated markets like the EU impose strict limits on how much is allowed in coffee sold to consumers, testing has shown that contamination levels can vary wildly between batches, origins, and processing methods, which is part of why some specialty roasters now market their beans as mold-tested or mycotoxin-free as a selling point, even though there's no universal requirement forcing every brand to test for it. Flavored and instant coffees carry their own blind spots. That bag labeled French vanilla or hazelnut cream almost never contains any actual vanilla bean or hazelnut. It's flavored using synthetic or natural flavor compounds, sprayed onto the beans after roasting. And natural flavor is a legally vague term that can legally describe a chemical built to taste like vanilla without a single vanilla plant involved in making it, similar to how it works in sodas and snack foods. Instant coffee and many pre-ground supermarket blends also tend to use lower grade, often Robusta heavy beans specifically because Robusta is cheaper and holds up better to the high heat processing instant coffee requires, even when the packaging leans on cozy, premium sounding language like classic roast or rich blend that implies quality without technically promising it. Then there's the certification problem, which might be the most frustrating part for people trying to shop responsibly. Labels like Fair Trade, Rainforest Alliance, and Organic all come from real certification bodies with real standards. But critics, including researchers and journalists who've investigated supply chains, have pointed out that certification usually happens at the farm or cooperative level, not at every single step afterward, which leaves room for mixing certified and non-certified beans further down the line before it reaches a bag with a green seal on it. Enforcement also varies a lot by region and by how frequently audits actually happen. So a stamp on the package is a signal of intent and standards, not an ironclad guarantee that every bean in that bag was traced start to finish. None of this means the certifications are worthless, just that they're only as strong as the auditing behind them, and that's inconsistent across the industry. Origin labeling is where things get almost comically loose. Single origin, estate grown, and small batch all sound like precise claims, but in most countries, including the US, there's no legal definition forcing a roaster to prove any of those terms before printing them on a bag. A company can call a blend small batch, even if it's produced in enormous volumes, because the term isn't regulated the way something like USDA organic is. Origin fraud, specifically, has been documented repeatedly by researchers using isotope analysis and DNA testing, techniques originally developed to catch counterfeit wine and honey, which have increasingly been turned on coffee because the price gap between a real high-altitude specialty bean and a cheap substitute is large enough to make faking it worth someone's while. Even the world's most expensive coffee claims aren't immune. Kopi Luwak, the coffee made from beans that have passed through the digestive tract of Asian palm civets, has been repeatedly exposed by investigative reporting as being sold in volumes far higher than the actual supply of authentic, ethically sourced civet coffee could ever produce, meaning a large percentage of what's marketed under that name on store shelves and specialty websites is almost certainly not the real thing. And the parts that are real often come from caged, mistreated animals rather than the wild foraging process the marketing implies. So what can an average shopper actually do with all this? Testing labs and food scientists generally point to a few practical signals. Look for roasters, who publish third-party lab results or mycotoxin testing on their own websites. Since transparency is usually a decent proxy for a company that isn't cutting corners, look specifically for Swiss water or CO2 processed on Decaf if the solvent question matters to you. Treat vague marketing language like gourmet, premium, small batch, and rich blend as flavor text rather than fact, since none of it is legally defined. And understand that certification labels are useful but not bulletproof, so buying from roasters who disclose their direct relationships with specific farms tends to be a stronger signal than a logo alone. None of this is meant to scare anyone off their morning routine. Coffee remains one of the most studied and, in moderation, one of the more health-associated beverages people drink daily. But the aisle full of confident-sounding words on shiny bags is doing a lot more marketing than it is disclosing, and the lab results consistently tell a messier, more diluted story than the packaging ever does.